remove these 3 bolts here with a 5mm Allen. There's one. Do the same to the rest of them. There we go. Now I'm going to take this engine cover from up top and just pry it up. It should pop right off. Set that aside. So for this bank here, it's a lot easier to replace, but for the rear, it's more difficult because we have to remove the intake. I'll show you both, but I'm going to start with this one here. Remove your 10mm bolt. Take that off, and you want to unplug the ignition coil. The clip for me is already broken, so it should just slide right off, but typically you would press it to unlock it, lift it up. For the spark plug, take your spark plug socket with a ratchet and just break it free. Remove it the rest of the way. There it is. Take your new spark plug, put it in your spark plug socket. That's why it's important to have a spark plug socket, because it actually grips onto the spark plug. It doesn't let it fall, so it doesn't get damaged. And I'm actually going to start it by hand to make sure it's not cross-threading. I'll just bring it as far down as I can. Okay, now I'm going to snug it, then we'll torque it. Okay, that's bottomed out. Let's get the torque wrench. Torque this to 18 foot-pounds. Perfect. Let's install the ignition coil. On the ignition coil, I like to put a little bit of dielectric grease. This is silicone paste, but this works as well. Basically, this is going to help the boot seal up against the spark plug, make a nice watertight seal, but also it's going to help it not stick over time. This rubber gets stuck to the spark plug, and when you go to pull it out to replace just the spark plugs, this sometimes breaks. So now with the silicone paste on there, press it down all the way. Get your bolt, start it in, and snug it up. Connect the electrical connector, and if you still had the little locking tab, obviously make sure it clicks on. Now you would do the same to all the other ones, then we'll move on to the rear. Next, if your vehicle has this strut brace, you're going to have to remove it so that the intake can come up and out of the way. 4 14mm nuts, 2 on each side. Take those out. There's 1. 2. Let's do the same to the other side. Now this is free to come up, so lift it off the studs, and this is attached to it, and I'm not going to remove it. I'm actually just going to take this and flip it over to the side like this, leave it this way. I'm going to remove this bracket that holds all of this in place. 2 10mm nuts, 1 on each side. There it is. Okay, lift this up. Now that this is free, I just want to move it further, so pop this connector off here, remove this hose from over there, and this one right here. Now you can get this further out of your way. I'm just going to leave it right here. Next, I'm going to vacuum up this intake area so that I remove all of this debris that's there. Now remove this hose from this assembly. So what I want to do is actually, I should explain, is I'm going to disconnect the throttle body off of this part of the intake. So I'm going to leave this on the intake. I think it'll be the most efficient to do it this way. And basically I just have to disconnect this hose, and then the 4 bolts. All right, so this broke, and I'm going to have to obviously replace it, but I'm going to try to just peel it off of here. One way or another, this hose has to come off and the clamp has to be replaced. So whatever I have to do to get this off. There we go. Once it's off, I'll worry about replacing the clamp. It'll be easier with it disconnected. So because this clamp is so weak, it's actually not even holding it on. I'm just going to twist it and remove it. I'll worry about that for when I reinstall it. And at this point, with a 10mm, I can unbolt the 4 bolts that hold the throttle body onto this part of the intake. So 4 bolts, 1 on each corner. I'll remove those. To take these bolts out, I actually have to pull this part of the intake back a little bit so I have room for my socket. Someone, I guess, replaced the clamp with a wire tie, so I'm going to have to cut it, and then I'll have to either put another clamp on or another wire tie. But I have to remove this, so I'm just going to cut it out of the way here. Now you can take this, wiggle it, and just pull it straight back. You don't have to remove it, you just have to pop it off like that. Now you can fit your socket in here and remove the 4 10mm bolts that hold this throttle body on. Now right behind the throttle body, there's that bolt right there. That's a 12mm. That's going to have to get loosened up and removed. Okay. Okay. Go ahead and remove it. Set it aside safely. You'll see this hook here. If you follow it down, you'll feel a 14mm bolt. That has to get removed as well. So I'm going to use a wrench and just loosen it up. That way I get some leverage. If you try to fit a socket and ratchet in here, that's actually just going to bottom out on the back here. So don't get your tool stuck in there. And now that it's broken free, I'm going to switch to a ratcheting wrench so I can get that out faster. Okay, the bolt's out. Remove it, set it aside safely. Now the intake is loose from both of these rear brackets, so all we have to do is come up front here and disconnect these 4 Allen bolts and the 2 12mm nuts. I'm going to start on the outside, remove these 2 14mm nuts, then I'll switch to my 8mm Allen and remove the bolts. Okay, 1 and 2. Set those aside safely, continuing from the outside in. Make sure this Allen head seats itself into the bolt. These strip out easily. Okay, these are pretty tight apparently. There's one. Let's do the same for all of them. Now let's take this last one out. Okay, remove this bracket and just set that aside. Okay, I'm going to vacuum up this debris so it doesn't fall when I lift up the intake. Disconnect this hose here. When you do this with pliers, be very gentle. Try not to break it. Usually twisting it breaks it free. There we go, set that aside. Now you can grab your air intake, lift it up, just wiggle it out of place here. I'm going to just very gently use this pry bar and help it along. Now if you lift up the PCV hose on this rear part here will disconnect itself. We'll just have to make sure we reconnect it when we reinstall. But here's your intake. Now let's do the ignition coils and spark plugs on the back side. At this point I'm just going to do the same to these 3. I'm going to do all 3 at once. Let's get the ignition coils back. the electrical connector clicks in. That way it's locked in. Start in your bolts. Snug them up. So for me, this surface is somewhat clean, but in case yours is not, you can take a razor blade and scrape away the debris. I'm going to go around it just to make sure that everything is nice and clean. And you can either use a vacuum and vacuum at the same time, which is what I'm going to do. That way nothing falls down in there. Or you can stuff some rags in here. Just don't make them go too far down, otherwise they'll be stuck forever. But basically just try not to get debris into the intake holes. Now with the clean surface, I'm going to take a fresh rag with some brake parts cleaner on it, and I just want to wipe off any sort of dust or oils that might be left over here. That way the gasket has a nice area, nice clean area to seal up against. I do strongly recommend new gaskets every time you remove the intake. You can reuse old ones, but there's always the potential for leaks since they are already used and compressed. But again, in a pinch, you can reuse them. Go ahead and wipe off any debris that's on the bottom of the intake as well. And again, I do recommend new gaskets. Unfortunately, I don't have any new gaskets, but mine are still squishy. They're not hard, and they have some material left to them so they can compress up against the lower intake. And at this point, I'm going to put this on. I do want to reiterate the fact that this hose needs to actually go onto this right here. So as I slide on the intake, obviously this hose is very short, so there isn't much space to connect this. So as I slide the intake on, I'm going to also slide the hose down. That just fit right on. That's perfect. Now make sure everything else is situated where it needs to be, and that's in my way. So there we go. Double checking that hose, making sure it's still on. And now I have to bring it up and over the studs. All right, that just fell right into place. I'm double checking this hose in the back to make sure it's still fully connected. Otherwise you have some big air leaks. It is. So that's perfect. Next, what I'm going to do is put on this bracket that goes across here. This goes to the throttle body there. It actually went underneath, I believe. Just like this. There we go. Slide it over the studs. And now I'm going to start these two nuts on, which are these two. There's one. And second one. And now the 4 bolts. Okay, start them all on by hand. That way they're not cross-threading. Now we'll snug them up. Okay, I'm going to work my way from the inside out at this point. So I'll start with this one. Okay, I just want to bottom it out. I'm going to come back and torque them. And the last thing we have left is the 2 14mm nuts. 1 and 2. Okay, let's get the torque specs. 21 foot-pounds, starting from the center, going out. And the 2 nuts. Okay, now I'm actually going to go back and double check all of them to make sure that they're still at 21 foot-pounds. The reason for that is when you torque down rubber gaskets like this, usually once you get to the last few bolts or fasteners, the first ones start to loosen up because the gasket compresses. So I'm just going to go back and double check. Okay. And the nuts. Those are still where they were, I'm sure. Yep. Okay, perfect. Now let's put on these two rear brackets that hold the back of the intake on. Okay. Let's tighten up this 14mm bolt on the passenger side of the intake. And the torque for this is 15 foot-pounds, but there's no way to get a torque wrench back here, so I'm just going to make it tight with my wrench. That should be plenty tight for this bolt. It's just here to support the intake, basically. It's not here to seal or do anything very important. Now, the 12mm on the driver's side, part of the intake, towards the throttle body. Try to get that one started. And let's snug it up. Okay, 15 foot-pounds for this one too, but again, there's no way I can get a torque wrench in here, so I'm just going to make it snug. If you run into the same issue with your clamps being rotted out, you definitely have to replace them, otherwise they won't seal up. So do whatever you have to do to get this old clamp off. Sometimes it can be tricky, but if you just work at it with some pliers, it should eventually come off. And let's get the new clamp on. Of course, this is going to require a screwdriver, but at least now it can be secured. So might as well slide this on while I'm at it. Make sure it's bottomed out all the way. Let's get a screwdriver and tighten this up. Okay, make sure it's nice and snug. It's easy to over tighten these clamps, so be careful, because once they strip out internally here where the screw is, it's basically trash. You have to put a new one on, but that one's nice and tight, so that's perfect. Let's get this hose back. And put this back as well. Add two nuts, one here and one here. Get this hose back. All right, and this one. Perfect. All right, let's get the throttle body back. Started all 4 bolts. There we go. Okay, start them all on by hand. And then I'll tighten them up and torque them. Let's snug them all up. Now let's torque these 4 to 8 foot-pounds. There's that one. Let's move up to this one over here. Perfect. And last one down underneath. For that one, I'm just going to move this out of the way. All right, perfect. Now I put a new clamp on here, that way it can be sealed up properly. Slide this intake snorkel over the throttle body, make sure it's bottomed out completely, and let's tighten up the clamp. Now that it's snug, I'm just going to do it by hand to tighten it. These clamps can strip out easily, and you don't want to do that, otherwise it's drunk. But basically, make it tight. That's perfect right there. There is one more hose to be reattached, and it actually goes right up here to the intake. Press that on all the way, make sure it's secure. Perfect. Now to put this engine cover on, you'll see these 2 hooks on the back of the cover. They actually have to hook onto these 2 areas right here, so line that up. It's easiest to actually line it up with the oil filler cap. Once that slides on, it kind of just falls into place, and then lock it down. And then let's put in the little bolts at the front. Okay, I'm going to start them on by hand, then I'll snug them up. Okay, do the same to all three. Now take the strut brace, line it back up with the two studs on each side. There we go. Press it down on, and let's re-secure it. I'm going to start on the nuts, bottom them out, and then I'll grab the torque wrench and we can torque them. You want to torque this to the same torque that the strut gets torqued to, because these are technically the top of the strut. So we'll do this on both sides. Okay, let's bottom it out. $59 foot-pounds. Tight. This is hitting the wire. Hang on. Okay. Perfect.